This is Clarence. He is 1 year old today. These are his friends. Like all babies, they were born with 100 billion neurons, nearly twice as many as an adult, even though their brains are half the size. Their brains are growing faster than any other part of their bodies. 60% of their metabolism is being spent on growing their brains. By 3, their brain volume will have doubled. But those 100 billion neurons will not stay forever. As the children move, play, and learn, these neurons are being connected into circuits. Circuits that govern emotions, motor skills, and speech. The circuits that are used get reinforced. The circuits that are neglected get pruned away. What remains is a basic structure that will influence the rest of their life. It is how they will see the world. It will influence their thinking, feelings, their joys and fears. Most of how the world will seem, how they will fit, what they will do, will come from this brain. So if you want to change the world for the future, build the brain. Focus on these first 3 years. And in the first 3 years, parents make the difference.
Welcome everyone to this evening discussion, and thank you for those of you who watched American Tragedy. Josh Sabey, the director of American Tragedy, and the whole team and I are thrilled it is now available to the public on most video-on-demand places. We want to start by thanking and honoring the 4 women who shared their stories. That is a brave thing to do. Sue Klebold, Liza Long, Laura Freeman, and Lisa Neeson trusted us with their stories, and we are so grateful to them. I am very grateful that we have Dr. Jose Silva with us. He is the president of the Colorado Association for Infant Mental Health, and he will introduce our guest. Thank you, Dr. Silva.
Lisa, thank you so very much for the invitation to participate tonight. I have the esteemed pleasure and honor of introducing Dr. Peter Langman. Dr. Peter Langman is a sought-after expert on the psychology of school shooters and on other preparations of mass shootings. He is currently the Director of Research and School Safety Training with DriftNet Securities. He conducts trainings on understanding the psychology of school shooters and identifying potential school shooters for professionals in mental health and education, and also on law enforcement. He has spoken on preventing school shootings at the FBI National Headquarters and has been hired by Homeland Security to train professionals in school safety. He is also a researcher with the National Threat Assessment Center of the United States Secret Service. In 2018, he was invited by the Department of Homeland Security to participate in the National School Safety Roundtable. Through his primary focus is school shootings, he has spoken to the FBI headquarters on white supremacy, homegrown Terrorists and Violent Extremists on American Jihadists in the National Counterterrorism Center. Dr. Langman served on Pennsylvania's Joint State Government Commission's Advisory Committee on Violent Prevention in the wake of Sandy Hook attack. His recommendations on preventing school shootings are presented by the CEO of the American Psychology Association to President Obama. His research on school shootings has been cited in congressional testimony on Capitol Hill. Dr. Langman, thank you so very much for coming today. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience and what is your greatest takeaway from American tragedy?
Well, I've been studying school shooters for over 20 years now, and this has become the focus of my career. So, I come to the film with a long history of studying this topic. And, one of the frustrating things with a lot of the coverage of school shooters is how much it focuses on external things. And not that they're not important or that they don't have some role, but, two of the main ideas about school shooters is they're reacting to bullies or they're influenced by violent media, video games, etc. And there may be some truth to those things, but those are both external to the shooters. And I think the strength of the film is the focus on what's going on inside the shooters, on their mental state, their psychological dynamics, because I think we have to look there. Certainly everything's an interaction between what's going on inside and what happens to us externally, but I think there's been far more focus on the externals and not enough focus on what's going on inside the shooters. And I think that's something that the film really brought out, that to take Dylan Klebold for an example, even with a loving, supportive, involved family, there was a lot going on inside him that he kept secret and nobody had a clue about. And I think we need to do more to tap into what's going on inside our kids, because that's so important.
Dr. Langman, you touch on a specific issue here. There was a lot of secrets. And so within that, what does the public need to understand from your research? I think you hit on a pivotal piece there when you say the secrets in his journals.
Well, I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about what mental health issues looks like, what mental illness means. People may think they could recognize it if they see it. Certainly, if my child had mental health issues, I would know as a caring parent, and that's not really the case. Kids, anyone, especially teenagers though, may be very good at hiding what's going on inside, either out of embarrassment, they don't want people to know, they're trying to put on a brave face. But we could be going to school with or interacting on a daily basis with people with significant mental health struggles and not know it because of their ability to put on that brave face to look like they're doing okay.
Thank you for that answer. That leads us right directly into a next question that we received from a former student at Arapahoe High School by the name of Carl Pearson. He spoke about his experience being in the classroom with the school shooter the day before. They were celebrating and laughing and jovial, and the spirit was one of high spirits and of liftedness. He's trying to understand a piece that now haunts him, and that is, how can a person show no signs the day before he plans to kill his friends and classmates? The experience that haunts him is the day before, and yet then the next day this individual came in. Why would that haunt him? What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I think it haunts him because it gets to that issue of, we would think we would know a mass murder if we were sitting next to him in class, and we don't necessarily have the ability to see that, especially if they're determined not to let anyone see it. Now, in this case with Carl Pearson, it's not that there were no warning signs. The student may not have been aware of the warning signs, but Carl Pearson, who committed his attack December 13th, 2013, had made a homicidal threat to a teacher at school on September 3rd that year. And the school knew about it, and they conducted a threat assessment. And at that point, they decided Carl was a low-level risk. Now, between September 3rd and December 13th, there were other warning signs. And sometimes the students saw them, other times teachers didn't necessarily know Carl was planning an attack. They didn't know that, but they were afraid of Carl, put off by his rage. Carl talked about having bought a gun, and he nicknamed his gun Kurt Cobain, which is ominous because Kurt Cobain killed himself. He would make comments like, if a student got him angry, don't make me get Kurt Cobain. He talked about his hit list and would say things to students who got him mad. All right, that does it. Now you're on the list. There were students who were living in fear that Carl would bring a gun to school and do a school shooting. So the student who sent that question in may not have been aware of the warning signs, but that doesn't mean there were no warning signs. And that's a key point, because our best way of preventing an impending attack is to know the warning signs, for people to communicate the idea of see something, say something, to have the school do an investigation based on the reports that come in, either from students or staff, because typically there are warning signs along the way, and we need to be more sensitive to them as a society to catch things before they happen.
So, Dr. Langman, what do you tell schools that you are, if you are called in as an expert, what would you tell schools to do to be more safe?
You know, as a nation, we have done a good job of training people in reacting to an attack with lockdown drills, emergency response procedures, and so on. But that's the reactive piece. Where we're lagging behind as a nation is the proactive piece, meaning schools need to have threat assessment teams set up in their schools. They need to be trained. You need the policies and procedures. This has to be something that every school has in place for that time. And it may be a rare incident when there is a serious homicidal threat. They know how to respond and investigate. So we've done fine with the reactive piece. We're not up to speed with the proactive piece. And if I could circle back to that question again, and you know, I just want to express, you know, how devastating these attacks are for that student who sat there and has been haunted by this. You know, these attacks just devastate communities for years and years, not just the direct victims, but anyone in that school, in that community. You know, the question of how someone can look fine one day as he's planning mass murder the next day. You know, Carl had written in his journal, "I'm a psychopath with a superiority complex." And psychopaths are not only very narcissistic and callous and maybe even sadistic, but some of them are very skilled at conning people. And that's called impression management. They know how to make a good impression when they want to. So if you think of what a con artist is, someone who can earn your trust and then take advantage of you or exploit you financially or whatever it may be, that ability to con people makes it very difficult to know, you know, who's at risk if they're really skilled at keeping things quiet. Now, as I said, Carl Pearson did leave a trail of warning signs, but for a lot of people, they didn't see that. They saw the smiling Carl who seemed like an okay kid.
Wow. We have another question, unless you want to say anything else about what you feel like the public should understand from your research. What should the public understand?
You know, there's no such thing as a profile of a school shooter. And I think there's a lot of focus on trying to understand the so-called profile, or to simplify it to a single cause like bullying, video games, or whatever it may be. And you know, based on my research, there's an incredible diversity among school shooters in terms of why they're doing the attack, their family backgrounds, their life histories, their personalities, how popular they are, how academically skilled they are, where they fall in terms of you know, intellectual ability, athletic ability. You see all kinds of kids committing these attacks. And that's important, one, because we have to understand there's a lot of different factors that put someone on this path. It's not just any one simple thing. It's also important to recognize, because if we think we know what a school shooter looks like, and there's a warning sign from a kid who just doesn't fit our notion, it could be captain of the football team or even a popular cheerleader, because sometimes girls do these attacks too. If we think we know what a school shooter looks like, we could minimize the warning signs because we just don't take them as seriously if it's from a kid who doesn't fit our profile. So we need to recognize the complexity of causes, contributing factors, and also the diversity of the perpetrators.
Oh, that makes it pretty broad. I want everybody who is listening to know that they can text in any questions with the number 307-655-6396, and we will read the questions to Dr. Langman. Dr. Langman, I want to get back to the complexity of this equation, that there's not a profile and there's a huge direction in the behavioral health to not conflate mental illness with violence. Yet we're talking about the mind of a school shooter. Can you help tease this out? Tease out the idea, are people who are mentally ill more likely to be violent, or what is it that we can understand as a society in relation to these two things, violence and mental illness?
Okay, very complex question, but an important one. And mental illness itself is a problematic concept. For some people, they use it to mean any psychiatric diagnosis. So if you have depression or anxiety or PTSD or an eating disorder, that could fall within the umbrella term of mental illness. But often it's used in a much more restrictive way to refer to something like schizophrenia, what's called like a major mental illness, a psychotic disorder, and so on. Regardless of those definitions, overall, people with a psychiatric condition, whether it's schizophrenia, depression, anxiety, are no more likely to commit, violent act like a school shooting than other people. So there's no clear connection there. So if we took all people with any kind of diagnosis or mental health issue, put it in a pie chart, there'd be a tiny little sliver of those who commit acts of violence. On the other hand, if we look at the population of school shooters or mass attackers, that pie chart would have a more substantial segment of people with mental health issues. So it's complicated. And depending, again, how you define mental health issue makes a big difference. Most are not psychotic, but if you include, depression, having suicidal thoughts, then that percentage gets bigger. If you include personality disorders, like someone who has a psychopathic personality, antisocial tendencies, very narcissistic, that piece of the pie would get bigger. So a lot really depends on what you mean by mental illness or mental health issues.
That is a confusing thing. Go ahead, Dr. Silva.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say I had a follow-up to that has kind of been sparking my mind in terms of some of the research that I'm seeing or people are speaking about. But do you see, and maybe not, but is there a correlation between, we talk about like generational wealth, generational poverty. In your research, have you seen a generation of where maybe their lineage, there have been violent acts or tendencies? Have there been pieces where you've maybe seen that in your research?
Yes. In my research, I tend to focus on 3 different types of perpetrators. And one of those types is what I call the traumatized school shooter. Now, trauma in the family can occur at any socioeconomic level. But at this population, what we see a lot of is they're at the lower end, sometimes severe poverty, sometimes not so severe, but certainly the lower end of the economic spectrum, with parents who are alcoholic, drug addicted, there's domestic violence, there's child abuse. Some of the parents have served time in prison. So you have these, chronically violent, dysfunctional families out of which these school shooters emerge. So that's not most of the school shooters, but that is a significant portion of them who come from that background where there's role models for violence. And in fact, I track how many of these shooters had someone else in the family who engaged in the illegal use of firearms. And often it's a father, an older brother, somebody in the family has a history of criminal behavior with guns. So however we interpret that, maybe as a role model or just the genetics passing from one generation to the next, you do see that kind of pattern among a subsection of the school shooters.
It's amazing the complexity of behavioral issues. They're just not simple. And generational issues are very real, but there are also people who have been in very dysfunctional families who end up getting their doctorate. Right, Dr. Silva?
That is correct. That is correct. And so that's why I asked that question, because it really, there's a lot of fascination for me in terms of when they always say, those that make it come from the same household, you know, I have a twin sister, that was my twin brother, and we come from the same, but there's all those questions, right? And so your research has really just opened up a lot of questions for me around that. So thank you for that. I really appreciate that.
I have another question. What are the risk factors for violence? Are there kind of designated risk factors? I'm assuming there's been research on that.
Again, it depends how you define violence. You know, my particular focus is school shooters, mass attackers, and so on. There's all kinds of levels of violence, from gang violence, domestic violence, and so on. So I'm not sure what the person asking the question is really getting at. But when it comes to school shooters, you know, one of the risk factors, I think, would have to be that kind of highly dysfunctional, violent background, combined with other things. And, you know, most shooters don't come from that kind of a background. If they don't, though, they tend to either be of the psychopathic type, like I spoke of earlier with Carl Pearson, or someone who's very psychotic, like schizophrenic, with, you know, hallucinations and delusions and so on. So you have these different typologies, but most people who are psychopathic or psychotic or come from traumatic families don't commit these attacks. So again, there's levels here. Those are things we see commonly among the school shooters, but then there's other factors, such as a lot of them are extremely frustrated in terms of dating, love, sexuality, chronic failures, disappointment, and so on. So they may feel very hopeless and depressed about that. A lot of them have either disciplinary issues at school and or academic failures at school. So maybe other things that have them feeling hopeless, depressed, etc. Some of them get arrested in the community. So there's another setback, another blow to their sense of self or their hope for the future. Now they have a criminal record. So what I try to do to sum this up, to minimize the complexity for a moment, is it's a combination of who they are and what happens to them. You know, if you're psychopathic or psychotic or extremely traumatized, and you have failure after failure after failure and rejection, and your life's falling apart, and you're hopeless and depressed and maybe suicidal, and you're very angry because of all of this, then you're seeing a combination of factors that might put someone on this pathway.
I'll have to tell you, one of my surprising experiences in making the movie is learning great compassion for people who, you hate to say with people who are violent, you're never compassionate about the violence, but you start realizing that these kids are often suffering deeply. Mm-hmm. And I think the most poignant point of the movie in my mind is when Sue tells the story of Dylan coming in, and he's mad at him, and she pushes him against the refrigerator. And she goes, if I could take one thing back, that's what I'd take back. That little tiny experience of not realizing it wasn't about her frustration, but that he was really suffering somehow. And so I appreciate the complexity of it. And, you know, Dr. Silva, according to what you were saying, the idea of generational dysfunction and not having skills to deal with life, not because they're not desires to do better, but they don't know how. So I think that is such an important point. We have another question. What does bullying have to do with school shooters? Is bullying part of the equation of becoming a school shooter?
You know, like everything else, it's complicated.
Yes.
I wish I could give you a simple answer, but there just isn't one.
Yeah.
Anything that, you know, contributes to a student feeling depressed, rejected, maybe enraged by mistreatment, anything like that, any external stressor can be one more factor if they're already at risk of being on that path. But then we have to remember that most kids are picked on to some extent at some point in their school. A study by the American Psychological Association found that between primary and secondary school, like 70% of students are picked on. And very, very few will commit an act of violence, certainly not a mass school shooting. And when we look at perpetrators themselves, some of them had been picked on. Some, it was at the level of teasing, but for some it was physical assault. These were kids who were being beaten up, and not just one time. So in some cases, that was a major issue. But we don't see that in all the cases. In some cases, the shooters weren't bullied at all. And in some cases, they were the bullies. The school shooters were, you know, narcissistic, abrasive, callous people who picked on other kids, and that eventually escalated into a mass attack. And in some cases, it went both ways. They got picked on, they picked on others, so it's hard to tease out how important that was. Now, one way of understanding motivation is through the principle of victim selection. Who were the targets? Now, a lot of school shootings have no specific targets. They're just random attacks against anyone. They just want to kill as many people as possible. But a fair number of school shootings have one or more intended victims. And in my last book, I looked at 48 perpetrators and divided the victims into categories. Only 1 out of the 48 went out of his way to find and kill a kid who had picked on him. And he only did that at the instigation of a couple of his buddies who suggested that to him. More often, there were 3 shooters who went after rivals, like kids who were going out with their ex-girlfriend, that kind of situation. 6 of them actually killed their own family members. So if we're looking at motivation, you have to wonder what's going on in those homes. 9 of them went after girls or women, either specific individuals they felt rejected by, or misogynistic attacks against women in general. But 18 of them went after a school staff member. Teachers who failed them, gave them a bad grade, flunked them for the year, administrators who suspended or expelled them, and so on. So when we're looking at victim selection across those 48 perpetrators, 1 sought out a bully, 18 sought out school personnel, 9 sought out girls or women. So is bullying sometimes a factor? Sure, of course. But when we look at the range of victims who were specifically targeted because there was a perceived grievance or injustice, we see that it's a lot bigger than just being picked on at school.
I really appreciated once when I was asked, when somebody was talking about bullying and that we need to have an anti-bully campaign, and somebody came back with, we need to teach people not to believe the bully. And that kind of struck me as, boy, we need to start thinking about what are the skills we can actually give everybody, because almost everybody does experience bullying, and give them the skills to say, I don't have to accept what that person said to me. Mm-hmm. I can challenge that, and I can look at what my friends say about me and not accept that. That needs to be happening, I think, giving these students from a young age the ability to question if somebody's critical of you or mean to you. You don't have to accept that. Right. That was a beautiful experience for me. I have several questions still. I feel that people tend to really demonize school shooters. I think this is harkens back to what we talked about. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? The school shooter I knew didn't always seem like a terrible person at all.
Well, that gets back to your point about having a sense of empathy for these kids, recognizing that they're suffering. And if we just look at them as monsters, that does not further our understanding of them. If we look at them as kids suffering, kids lacking in social skills, kids with mental health issues, that gives us a path for intervention. If we simply think of them as demons, monsters, etc., that doesn't lead us anywhere. And I don't believe that any of these kids were born to become mass murderers.
And
so if we can intervene along the way by recognizing these are kids in need of something, I think that's a more fruitful approach.
Lisa, if I can kind of expose on that a little bit, Dr. Langman, you're like, there's this thinking that you keep talking about proactive prevention over intervention. I'm loving that. And that's the place I sit in. You keep hitting on that. What are some preventionary tools, or how can we be proactive by entering into the building? What are those things we can do as a community to be proactive, to offer those spaces of intervention?
There's levels or types of intervention. If you're dealing with a potentially violent student, threat assessment is the gold standard for intervention. If you're talking more broadly, going back to the idea of these, chronically violent, dysfunctional homes, that's, child welfare. It's having the resources to get someone into that home to stabilize it. And if that's not possible, getting this child out to a safe, stable environment. When we're talking about, mental health issues, in some cases, parents knew that their teenage kids were struggling in some way, but they didn't recognize that what they were witnessing was the onset of schizophrenia. They may have thought, well, my kid's a little different, or he seems really anxious, he's not quite like his peers, something's a little off. But as a nation, I don't think our society is really well educated about mental health issues, what things look like, and what to do if you see it. So that more broadly, I think that's an important piece of intervention.
Thank you.
I want to remind people who may want to text in a question. The number is 307-655-6396. Now we have a question from Art Levine, author of the Mental Health Inc. And he wants your input, and this is a specific thing, about the School Threat Assessment Response Team program launched in 2007 after the Virginia Tech massacre. The acronym is START, I think. Do you have thoughts on that?
I cannot offer specific comments on that. I know there's a lot of programs out there. I'm not well versed enough to have a meaningful response. I'm sorry.
Oh no, that's. So what would the approach be to help treat someone who shows signs of tendency towards violence and suicidal ideation?
Again, there's no simple answer, because that could be due to a lot of different things. If you meet with the student, you try to, establish communication where they can tell you what's going on. And is there something to resolve? Is it a friendship issue, a romantic issue? Is it a home issue with the parents? Is one of the parents a drug addict, and all kinds of people in and out of the home? But you need to have that relationship with the student so they feel comfortable telling somebody, whether it's a teacher, guidance counselor, psychologist, etc., because we don't know what the intervention should be if we don't know what's causing the distress in the first place. So it really comes down to, communication and establishing the trust so that students can open up to somebody.
And what's so complicated, just like you're saying, Dr. Langman, this is so complicated. What's so complicated is often when they're feeling these feelings, these rages, or these depressive feeling, they don't want to talk to people. There's something about trying to kind of becoming a shell of a person, and in a very closed shell. And so even if you want to talk to them, they might not open up. So it just keeps you keep realizing how complicated that it is to help a person open up about what's wrong in their life so that they don't make things worse in their life. And for parents, I know so many parents who so desire to have their child open up to them, and it doesn't happen. And it's not because they're not skilled. It's not because there's not love. It's because the child refuses.
Right. And it doesn't have to be the parent they open up to. If the parents can get them to a counselor, a mental health professional, that may be a lot easier for the kids rather than trying to share really personal things with their parents. So if the parents can do that, great, if they can open up that channel of communication. But if not, see if we can get them to a mental health professional. And this is where there's a larger issue here too, because the whole idea of mental health treatment still has a significant stigma. So in terms of what we can do as a nation is we can, fight against that stigma and try to make seeing a counselor or psychologist as routine as seeing your dentist and eye doctor, that you just go when you need to, or you go for a regular checkup, just to have someone to talk to make sure you're okay. But right now we don't have that. And there's a stigma that will keep kids from going and even keep parents from wanting to take their kids because they don't want people to think their kid's crazy or that they're bad parents. Look, my kid has to go to a psychologist. We need to get rid of that stigma.
I had a beautiful experience with a loved one who said that she really appreciated being able to go to a therapist because she could vent and not hurt. That if she were to, or scare, that if she were to vent to somebody in her family, it would hurt them and they would worry. And this was a safe place for her to be able to vent. And that brought insight to me about the power of having a good counselor who would listen and help you navigate. We have a really, I think, important question. Obviously, there is value in recognizing and addressing threats of violence, but with actual school shootings being relatively rare, might it not be more productive to try to instill the skills and beliefs that will help students rise above the mental states that lead to violent behavior?
Great question. And I don't see it as an either or, it's a both and. Setting up threat assessment doesn't mean that we don't try to do everything possible to make threat assessment unnecessary, but there's no guarantee. It's not a perfect world. So even if we're doing everything we can as a family and a society and a school to instill, confidence and stability and well-being in our kids, we're not going to be perfect. So certainly that is absolutely critical, but let's cover as many bases as we can.
Jose, Dr. Silva, do you want to read one of the questions that maybe would be interesting to you?
Yeah, as I'm looking through some of the questions here, it's just fascinating to see the participation. So thank you, everybody that is just sending in your questions. I'm a victim of gun violence. I've buried over 200 people in my lifetime due to gun violence or violence in my community. And so this conversation around mental wellness, our young people. Can you talk about what we can do as a community during the ages of 0 to 3? What have you learned about the school shooters maybe that didn't take place in their early on life, in the early onset? And what are some pieces maybe that we're missing? I often wonder, as I look back, are we missing something? And I wonder, is something going on between the ages of 0 to 3 that we should be paying more attention to?
That's a great question. And I wish I had more information, but often we just don't get that information. By the time they're 16, 18 years old, no one's asking about the first 3 years of their lives. Now, in some cases, though, we do have some information. And something that struck me is a fair number of school shooters and other perpetrators of mass violence had some major medical issues at either in the birth process, infancy, and so on. And some of those medical issues and procedures may have been traumatic for them, may have resulted in some lasting scars. But we don't have in-depth information about that period in the perpetrators' lives. But that has intrigued me that in case after case, Sue Klebold talked about this with Dylan, he nearly died at birth due to pyloric stenosis,
Correct.
So what were the medical procedures? Was he isolated from his family? Was he not getting the physical touch because he was in an intensive care unit? A lot of shooters seem to have had that kind of medical procedure or major illnesses that may have scarred them, but no one knew about it at the time. Sung-Hui Cho, the Virginia Tech shooter, had some major issues as a toddler, and supposedly after age 3, after he had I think it was a heart procedure, he just seemed different. Like that maybe really scarred him somehow. So we don't know a lot about the first 3 years, but in some cases we get little glimpses that there were things going on, but nothing that would make any sense in terms of predicting what they ended up doing. But there may have been some sort of emotional scar, or in some cases more physical, like lack of oxygen at birth, trouble breathing. Adam Lanza, Sandy Hook shooter, while he was still in his mom shortly before birth, had decreased movement, so they went in and took him out. And then he seemed okay, but 8 days later he stopped breathing and he had to be rushed to the hospital. Well, infants who stop breathing could have some level of brain damage, lack of oxygen. So there's just so many factors that could be playing into what we're seeing years later.
And I want to just being a mom and now a grandma of 8 and realizing my children may be watching this. Most people who have issues in their first 3 years of life are not going to end up being violent. And we're it is such a complicated issue. And we're saying little things maybe contribute to an accumulation of all these little things. And then combined with big things like genetics and personality, they all combine. And no one wants a parent just to be fearful. And there's another question. How much ethnic diversity is there in school shooters?
There's a lot more than people tend to be aware of, because there's a stereotype that they're always white males. And they're not always male. 4 of the 48 perpetrators in my last book were female. And on my website, I think I've got at least 9 female school shooters. And they're certainly not all white. And it seems, again, it gets a little complicated. It seems through 60s, 70s, and 80s into the 1990s, they tended to be more white. In the last 20 or so years, it seems to be a more diverse population. But even that has to be qualified, because when you're looking at perpetrators in secondary school, they tend to be more white. But when you're looking at perpetrators at colleges and universities, they tend to be less white. So, there's a lot of data. I have an article on my website looking at 50 years of school shootings, including this kind of demographic analysis. So, again, school shooters come in all shapes and sizes. They're certainly not all white. They're not all male. There's a lot of racial ethnic diversity, despite the sort of ongoing stereotype that they're always white males. That's simply not the case.
We will end with a pretty charged one that we received, politically charged. Do you feel that the recent call to defund police, remove school resource officers, and replace them with mental health counselors and social workers might help to normalize or destigmatize the behavioral conversations, make it easier for children to come forward when they first start having feelings of anxiety, depression, isolation, etc.?
Again, it's not an either or. Certainly, more mental health professionals in schools, I think, is a good thing. That doesn't mean we have to eliminate school resource officers to make that happen. School resource officers can play a very important role in keeping schools safe, in being mentors to students, in just keeping their finger on the pulse of what's happening in the school. They can get involved in teaching and coaching. So though I'm all for, a greater mental health presence in our schools, I don't think that has to come at the expense of our school resource officers. Because when someone does show up with a gun, I'm a psychologist, I'm not the one to intervene in that case. And you need someone who's trained and has the equipment and the know-how to make that intervention.
Dr. Silva, do you have any final question or anything you would like to ask before we end?
I would. I loved how you brought together the argument and really it laid forward the right ideology that we should all have. In that, if we implemented and shored up the supports of mental health, where are the areas that we as parents, community members, and those that are supporters can stand in the gap in supporting the need to be there for students?
Well, there's the saying, it takes a village, right? I think everyone can play a part as a parent, as a coach, as a member of the school community, parent-teacher organizations. We can do more to educate people about not only warning signs of violence, but symptoms of mental health issues and what to do when you see it, and just improving our understanding and, working together as a community, as a village, to keep people safe.
Wouldn't that be awesome? That's really what we need to go towards, is all of us taking responsibility for this. This is my responsibility, that I am going to learn mental health skills, and I'm going to try to teach them to my grandkids and help my neighbors, and be part of solution and not blame others, but be part of learning and contributing and making the change that will make a much better world. Dr. Langman, we are so grateful for you for being in the movie. You really helped in the movie, but also for taking this time. I just want to talk to the audience, and if your question did not get answered or asked, we are sorry. We did not have time for all of them, but thank you for sending them. And if you want to help us, Parents to Parents, we are going forward with another project, and the project is making short videos to help parents understand ways to teach mental health to their children. And if you want to stay informed, please subscribe to our YouTube, American Tragedy Movie. We will keep you informed about where we are. We'll probably update you on the videos, and stay involved in these conversations. We do not expect anybody to be here all 9 days of the incredible lineup we have, but we welcome you any of the days that you can. Tomorrow will be a special day. It'll be a day of stories of a mom from Boise who had a son who was violent, and in her home and in his school classes, they had evacuation plans when he got violent. And her story is powerful. And then we have a dad here in Littleton, Colorado, who adopted a child from Russia. And with an attachment deficit disorder, it has been incredibly complicated parenting this child. And I have seen this mom and this dad and his wife do everything they could and worry and not be able to help. And these will be powerful stories. If you can, please join us. Let's all commit to BrainFit for ourselves, for our loved ones, and for our communities. We must do this. Good night, and thank you.